The next step in the IB curriculum, once we've looked at how the economy works, that's the interaction of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and the different views of what aggregate supply might actually be. Then we looked at the 4 macroeconomic objectives, so, what do governments want to accomplish? Well, then finally we answered the question, well, how do governments try to accomplish what they want to accomplish? So that's what we're looking at here. We can break government policies into 2 major types. The first type is what we call demand-side policies, and these are policies that are aimed at affecting aggregate demand, so increasing or decreasing aggregate demand. These policies are always counter-cyclical, which is to say that if we're in a contraction, so if we're on the downward slope of actual output, if we're in a contraction, the government is going to try to expand the circular flow. During an inflation, which happens during an expansion, we practice contractionary policy. So if the economy is doing really well, if the circular flow is growing on its own, we try to contract it a little bit to keep it from growing too quickly. If the circular flow is shrinking, if we're here during a contraction, then we try to expand it to keep the contraction from lasting too long. There are 2 major ways that we try to change aggregate demand. They're different both in the tools that are used and in who is doing it. They're also different, we'll study both of these in depth next. They're also different in how often or how responsive they can be, and I suppose in the effects that they may have or who might be affected. Fiscal policy is essentially done through the government budget. Well, in terms of the circular flow, the government budget is how much money does the government have to spend? Well, that's going to come from taxes. The other part of the government budget then is, well, how much money does the government end up spending? And that's government expenditure G. So when we look at fiscal policy, it's really about the government sector, which is G and T. So expansionary fiscal policy would be when the amount of money that comes in as an injection, G, is greater than the amount of money that leaves the circular flow as taxation. Well, if government spending is greater than government revenue, that's what we call a government deficit. That should be a pretty familiar term because most governments tend to run deficits year to year. So that would be expansionary. Contractionary policy would be when the amount of tax is greater, so the amount of money that leaves is greater than the amount of money that the government spends. And that's referred to as a surplus budget. Those are pretty rare, and that's one of the weaknesses of fiscal policy that we'll talk about more later on. So this is about the budget, but it's always done by the legislators. So whoever it is in the country that proposes and then votes on the budget for the year, it tends to be the Parliament or Congress if you're in the US. The other major way of doing this, of changing aggregate demand, is by changing the amount of money available in the economy. This is what is referred to as the money supply. This is done through banks, and it's controlled by the central bank of a country. Each country has a central bank. In the European Union, this is called the ECB, the European Central Bank. In the United States, it's called the Federal Reserve. The major effect is going to be seen with the amount of savings versus the amount of investment as an injection. So again, expansionary monetary policy would be when investments are greater than savings. And contractionary monetary policy would be when the amount of savings are greater than the amount of investment. We most often hear about this. The most common tool that is used here are interest rates. So when you hear about interest rates going up or down and the effects that might have on the economy, that's what we're talking about with monetary policy. So demand-side policy is one major branch of how the government attempts to manage the economy. The other major branch, as you may have guessed, is what we call supply-side policies. And obviously that's going to be focused on changing aggregate supply. Now, as soon as we say aggregate supply, we have to remember that there's this distinction between long run and short run, which also kind of gives away who's going to favor this. Remember, Keynesians tend to focus on aggregate demand. They tend to see aggregate demand as the most important component of the economy. Therefore, Keynesians are clearly going to favor demand-side policies. But we'll see that there's one type of demand-side policy, supply-side policy, that they actually like too. Okay? In this, we're not really thinking about the business cycle itself. It's not a reaction to how the economy is doing. So someone who's going to favor supply-side policies is going to be of the mindset of, you know, the business cycle is always going to happen. Therefore, we can't just react to a contraction, expansion. Again, it's recognizing the limitation of reacting to what's happening in the economy. So here, it's more about creating a climate where the economy can grow. So, remember, aggregate supply is always about the quantity and quality of factors of production. So, since you're not going to consider what's actually happening with the business cycle, the goal is just to be continually improving the factors of production available to an economy. Market-based supply-side policy, and this is what was practiced quite heavily during the 80s by Reagan, by Thatcher. It tends to be a more conservative approach or neoclassical approach to managing the economy. This is basically going to rely on, you know, everything that was studied in microeconomics, the price mechanism and competition. It's going to rely on that to allocate resources properly. And the assumption is if resources are allocated properly, that's going to always keep the economy growing and, you know, keep the economy good. Interventionist supply-side policies is when the government is directing the attempts to improve the factors of production. So essentially here we can see that, you know, in the Keynesian view, well, if we're here at aggregate demand 1, the Keynesian is not going to look at this situation and think that aggregate supply is a problem. Clearly, in the Keynesian view, the problem at aggregate demand 1 is that aggregate demand isn't high enough. Therefore, the Keynesian is always going to choose to focus on demand-side policies there. Now, different Keynesians might prefer to have fiscal policy or prefer to use monetary policy, but in reality, they're probably going to use some of both. However, in the Keynesian view, if we're at aggregate demand curve 2 with Keynesian aggregate supply curve 1, they're not going to say that at this point the proper thing to do is to further increase aggregate demand. In their model, further increasing aggregate demand from here is only going to lead to higher price. So at this point, they're going to say, well, yeah, we need to improve the aggregate supply of the country. So they're probably going to mostly go towards interventionist supply-side policies. They may favor some of the market-based methods, but Keynesians being Keynesians, they want the government to have a part, so they're going to favor interventionists. In the monetarist view, well, likewise, they're mostly always going to be looking at market-based supply-side policy as the answer, but there may be some times where they see aggregate demand as the problem. So in this case, if we're at aggregate demand 1, they would recognize that, yeah, aggregate demand probably isn't high enough. But just like Keynesians tend to favor government involvement always, neoclassical economists are always going to favor no government involvement. So even here, where they're saying, yeah, aggregate demand needs to shift to the right, they're still going to point to less government control as the answer. So they're going to say we need to shift aggregate demand needs to shift to the right via more consumption and more investment. And the way that's going to happen is for the government to leave the economy alone. So they're still going to come back to a market-based solution to shift aggregate demand. You know, most market-based supply-side solutions are always about aggregate supply, but there is an argument that within that aggregate demand will also shift to the right if the government just leaves things alone, which is our classic laissez-faire argument.